Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world without smartphones, without electric lights humming in every room, without even a reliable way to silence the chaotic orchestra of your own thoughts, a world where if you couldn't sleep, your doctor might just hand you a train ticket. Picture this. You're in London, say 1850 or so. The city outside your window is a symphony of soot and horse manure. Gas lamps flickering against a fog so thick you could practically chew it. And here you are, lying in your bed, which, by the way, is probably full of bedbugs because pest control wasn't really a thing, yet staring at the ceiling, wondering why sleep refuses to visit you. You've tried everything. Warm milk, yes, laudanum, a little too much, actually, and now you're seeing things. Counting sheep, the sheep are laughing at you. You, my friend, are an insomniac in the Victorian era. And let me tell you, you probably wouldn't survive a week in that world. Not just because of the insomnia, but because of the sheer amount of effort it took to exist back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. Maybe you're in Tokyo at 3 a.m. or somewhere in the countryside where the only sound is the wind. I'd love to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to climb aboard something strange. We're about to explore why, for a brief moment in medical history, the prescription for a good night's sleep wasn't a pill or a tincture, it was a steam locomotive. You have to understand the context first. The Victorian mind was complicated. On one hand, it was an age of incredible progress. Railways were spreading like veins across the countryside, connecting cities that had never been connected, shrinking the world in a way that felt almost magical. On the other hand, it was an age of profound anxiety. People were worried about their health, their morals, their place in society, and sleep, or the lack of it, became a kind of obsession. Doctors started labeling insomnia as a distinct condition, not just a symptom. They called it wakefulness or sleeplessness, and they treated it with everything from cold baths to bizarre electrical shocks. But the railway was an accident, a beautiful, rhythmic, repetitive accident. Imagine yourself as one of those early passengers. You've never been on a train before. You buy your ticket, maybe it costs you a day's wages, and you board this loud, shaking metal beast. You sit down on a wooden bench, because cushioning is for the rich, and you brace yourself. The whistle blows, the engine lurches, and suddenly, you're moving faster than you've ever moved in your life. Faster than a horse, faster than the wind, it seems. The landscape blurs past you, green fields, smoky factories, little villages you've never seen, and there's this sound. This constant, hypnotic sound, the clatter of wheels on tracks, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic thumping of the pistons. You don't plan to fall asleep. You're too excited, too terrified, too alert. But 20 minutes in, something happens. Your eyelids get heavy, your head nods, and before you know it, you're out cold, drooling onto your collar, jerking awake only when the train screeches to a halt at the next station. And that, right there, is the moment Victorian doctors started paying attention. Because here's the thing about those early train journeys, they weren't designed for comfort, not even a little bit. You have to erase from your mind every modern idea of what a train feels like. No climate control, no noise-canceling headphones, no reclining seats with little trays for your snacks. What you had, instead, was a wooden bench that would make a church pew feel like a cloud, a window that didn't quite close, letting in gusts of coal smoke, and the constant, bone-shaking vibration of an engine that hadn't yet learned how to be polite. And yet, people kept falling asleep. Doctors noticed this. They weren't looking for it. Most of them were too busy worrying about things like cholera and the moral implications of women traveling alone. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Patients would come in complaining of weeks without rest, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling from exhaustion, and somewhere in the consultation they'd mention, almost off, that they'd taken a short trip to visit a cousin or handle some business. And on the train, just for a few minutes, they'd actually slept. Not well, perhaps, not deeply, but they'd slept out. Now, you have to understand the Victorian approach to medicine. It wasn't exactly what we'd call evidence-based today. If a doctor had a theory, he'd run with it, often straight off a cliff. Bloodletting was still hanging around, though it was finally falling out of fashion. Leeches were still applied to foreheads for headaches, and if you suggested that something as mundane as a train ride could cure a medical condition, well, that sounded just plausible enough to be worth exploring. So they started exploring. They began asking questions. What was it about the railway that made people drowsy? Was it the motion, the sound, the sheer exhaustion of holding yourself upright on a bench that seemed designed by someone who hated the human spine? Or was it something deeper? Something psychological, the fact that for the first time in your overworked, overstimulated life, you had no control. You couldn't stop the train. You couldn't make it go faster or slower. You couldn't even get off until it chose to stop. All you could do was sit there and surrender to the experience. That surrender, my friend, is a big deal. Think about it. In your modern life, how often do you truly surrender? You're always in charge, or at least you think you are. You control the temperature of your room. You control what plays in your ears. You control when you check your phone, when you answer a message, when you get up to pee. But on that Victorian train, you controlled nothing. You were a passenger in the most literal sense. And for a mind exhausted by the relentless demands of the industrial age, that lack of control was strangely liberating. But let's get specific. Let's talk about the sound, because the sound is crucial. That clatter, clatter, clatter of iron wheels on iron rails. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, predictable, monotonous in the most beautiful way. And it turns out, your brain loves monotony when it's trying to shut down for the night. Modern science calls this white noise. Though the sound of a train is technically more complex than that, it's a mix of frequencies, a kind of acoustic porridge that drowns out the sudden, jarring sounds that might otherwise wake you. A dog barking in the distance, a cart rattling past your window, your neighbor snoring through a paper-thin wall. The train's rhythm just absorbs it all. Victorian doctors didn't know about white noise. They didn't have decibel meters or frequency analyzers, but they had ears, and they had patience, and they started connecting dots. They wrote about it in medical journals, little observations tucked between articles on digestion and the dangers of tight corsets. One physician noted that his insomniac patients often reported their best sleep occurring not in their own beds, but during accidental naps on public conveyances. Another went further, suggesting that the railway might be harnessed deliberately as a kind of moving sleep clinic. And that's when the idea shifted from observation to prescription. You have to imagine the scene. You're sitting in a dimly lit Victorian consulting room, all dark wood and heavy curtains, smelling faintly of antiseptic and old books. The doctor across from you, probably with an impressive beard, because Victorian doctors really committed to facial hairs, listening to your tale of sleepless nights. You've tried everything. You've taken the tonics. You've endured the cold baths. You've even attempted the water cure, which involved being wrapped in wet sheets like a human burrito. And all it did was make you cold and damp and still awake. The doctor strokes his beard. He thinks for a moment, and then he says something you don't expect. Have you considered the railway? You blink. You think he's joking, but his face is perfectly serious. He reaches for his prescription, pad a small sheet of paper. Instead of writing down the name of a chemist or a dosage for laudanum, he writes something else. A destination, a time of day, a class of carriage. Take this, he says, handing you the paper. Present it at the station, and try to get some rest. And just like that, you've been prescribed a train ride. But here's where the story takes a slightly uncomfortable turn. Because the class of carriage your doctor prescribes matters more than you might think. If you're wealthy, if you're one of the lucky few who can afford a first-class ticket, your experience on that train is going to be very different from the experience of someone in third class. And for the purposes of treating insomnia, the cheap seats might actually work better. Let's talk about third class for a moment. Third class on a Victorian train is not something you'd willingly choose today. It's not just basic, it's almost punitive. The carriages are open to the elements, or close enough that you can feel the wind sneaking through every gap. The benches are bare wood, no cushions, no armrests, nothing to soften the impact of every jolt and bump. You're packed in with strangers, dozens of them, sometimes all smelling of whatever they've been doing all day, which in Victorian London could be anything from working in a factory to hauling fish. The air is thick with coal smoke from the engine, because the locomotive hasn't figured out yet that it should keep its fumes to itself. And the ride is rough, really rough. The tracks aren't as well laid as they'd later become, so you're bouncing and swaying and lurching in ways that make modern roller coasters feel tame. And yet, this is precisely the environment where sleep comes easiest. Think about that for a second. Why would discomfort help you sleep? Shouldn't a soft bed, a quiet room, perfect conditions, shouldn't those be the things that invite rest? Not according to your Victorian doctor. He understands something that modern sleep science has only recently confirmed. Sometimes, your brain needs to be overwhelmed. Sometimes, the gentle conditions are exactly what keep you awake, because they leave too much space for your thoughts to wander. for your anxieties to fill the silence. In third class, there's no silence. There's no space. You're surrounded, overwhelmed, bombarded by sensation. The cold on your face, the jostling of body, the constant, percussive rhythm of the wheels. It's too much for your conscious mind to process, so your conscious mind does the only thing it can. It checks out. It retreats. It lets the animal part of your brain take over, the part that just wants to survive the ride. And in that surrender, sleep finds you. Victorian doctors noticed this too. They wrote about the mesmeric quality of railway travel, comparing it to the hypnotic techniques that were fashionable at the time, and they started tailoring their prescriptions accordingly. If you were a delicate upper-class patient, prone to nervous complaints and fainting spells, they might suggest a first-class carriage with its padded seats and enclosed compartments. But if you were truly desperate, truly beyond the reach of ordinary remedies, they'd send you third class. They'd send you into the chaos. Now, imagine yourself in that carriage. You're clutching your prescribed ticket, feeling slightly ridiculous, wondering if anyone you know might see you and question your sanity. The train lurches into motion. You grip the edge of your bench, trying to steady yourself. The man next to you, he smells faintly of horses. He's already asleep, his head lolling onto your shoulder. Normally, you'd push him away. Normally, you'd be annoyed. But the doctor told you to surrender, so you don't. You let him lean. You let the rhythm take over, and something strange happens. The jolting that bothered you at first starts to feel predictable, almost soothing. The cold air on your face wakes you up even as your eyes grow heavy, creating a weird contradiction that your brain eventually gives up on resolving. The coal smoke stings a little, but it also smells familiar, like the city you've lived in your whole life. And that familiarity wraps around you like a blanket. You're not sure when you fall asleep. There's no clear line. One moment you're staring at the back of someone's head, watching the landscape blur through the gaps in the carriage wall, and the next moment you're somewhere else entirely, somewhere without thoughts, without worries, without the constant grinding of your own anxious mind. You're just gone. And then you wake up. The train is slowing. The station is approaching. The man who was leaning on you is gone, replaced by a woman with a basket of vegetables who gives you a sympathetic smile. You're disoriented. You don't know how long you've been asleep. It might have been minutes. It might have been an hour. But something has shifted inside you. Something feels different. You step off the train onto the platform, and the world seems slightly softer than before. The sounds are the same: the hiss of steam, the shouts of porters, the clatter of luggage, but they don't grate on you the way they used to. You feel like you've been somewhere else, somewhere restful, and you've brought a little piece of that somewhere back with you. That's the prescription working. That's the railway as medicine. And you're not alone in feeling this way. All over Victorian England, people are having the same experience. They're stepping off trains with heavy eyelids and lighter minds, wondering why their own beds have failed them when a wooden bench in a smoky carriage succeeded. Your doctor will ask you about it at your next visit. He'll want to know how many minutes you slept, whether the sleep was deep or shallow, whether you dreamed. He might adjust your prescription: a longer journey next time, or a different class of carriage, or a specific time of day. Because this is still experimental medicine. This is still the early days of understanding how environment affects the sleeping brain. But one thing is becoming clear. The railway works. For reasons nobody fully understands. The train has become a sleeping pill on wheels. And the Victorians, being Victorians, are about to take this discovery and run with it in ways that range from practical to absolutely bizarre. You might be wondering, at this point, what exactly is happening inside your body when that train starts moving? The Victorians had their theories, most of them charmingly wrong, but they were grasping at something real. Something your modern brain is hardwired to respond to. And to understand it, we need to go back much further than the 19th century. We need to go back to the very beginning of you. Because that rocking motion, that gentle side-to-side sway of the railway carriage, it's not just random movement. It's a lullaby your body has been listening to since before you were born. Think about it. For 9 months, you floated in a warm, dark, liquid world, surrounded by rhythm. Your mother's heartbeat, steady and constant. Her breathing, in and out. Her voice, muffled but present. And the motion, the gentle swaying as she walked, as she shifted position, as she went about her life. You felt all of it. You were cradled in movement. Then you were born, and suddenly everything was still. The rhythm was gone. The constant motion had stopped. And for some babies, that stillness is deeply unsettling. It's why they cry until they're rocked, why they settle in moving cars, why the mechanical sway of a cradle can work when nothing else will. Your brain associates that motion with safety, with the womb, with a time before worry existed. The Victorian train, whether anyone realized it or not, was tapping directly into that primal association. The rocking of the carriage wasn't perfectly regular. The tracks weren't that smooth, but it was regular enough. It was persistent. It was the kind of motion that says, over and over again, you're safe, you're held, you can let go. But here's where it gets interesting. The Victorians, being who they were, couldn't just leave it at that. They had to theorize. They had to explain. And their explanations tell us a lot about how they thought the body worked. One popular theory involved something they called cerebral congestion. The idea was that blood flowed to your brain when you were awake and active, and sleep happened when that blood retreated to other parts of your body. The rocking of the train, according to this theory, literally shook the blood out of your brain. It jostled it loose, allowed it to drain downward, leaving your thinking organ temporarily underpowered, and therefore asleep. It's completely wrong. Of course, blood doesn't work that way, but it's a lovely image, isn't it? Your thoughts being rattled out of your skull like coins from a piggy bank. Another theory focused on the nerves. Victorian medicine was obsessed with nerves. Every condition, from hysteria to indigestion, was eventually blamed on the nerves, and the railway, with its constant vibration, was seen as a kind of nervous massage. It stimulated the nerves just enough to tire them out, the way a long walk tires your legs. Exhausted nerves, the theory went, couldn't keep you awake. They needed to rest and recover. And that rest felt like sleep. There was also a psychological component. Though the Victorians didn't use that word, they talked about the monotony of the senses, the way the repetitive landscape, the repetitive sound, the repetitive motion, all combined to dull the mind. Your attention, constantly engaged in ordinary life, was finally allowed to relax. There was nothing new to see, nothing new to hear, nothing new to fear. The world outside the window was a blur of sameness, and so your mind, with nothing left to grab onto, simply let go. Modern science, looking back at all this, has added some fascinating details. We now know about something called entrainment, the tendency of your brainwaves to sync with external rhythms. When you hear a steady, repetitive sound, your neurons start firing in patterns that match that rhythm, and certain rhythms, particularly those around 3 to 4 cycles per second, are associated with the early stages of sleep. The train, it turns out, was literally drumming you into unconsciousness. We also know about the role of proprioception, your body's sense of where it is in space. When you're on a moving train, your brain is constantly receiving tiny signals about the motion, the acceleration, the tilting of the carriage. It's processing all of that information in the background, using up cognitive resources that might otherwise be devoted to worry or planning or rumination. The train gives your brain something to do, something mindless but absorbing, and in that absorption, sleep finds an opening. And then there's the social aspect, which the Victorians definitely noticed but didn't quite know what to do with. On a train, especially in third class, you're surrounded by strangers, and there's something about being in a crowd of people who don't know you, don't care about you, don't expect anything from you. It's liberating in a strange way. You're anonymous, invisible, free from the endless performance of being yourself. You can let your face relax, your posture slump, your guard drop, and when your guard drops, sleep can sneak in. The Victorians had a word for this state. They called it oblivion. Not in the negative sense. We sometimes use not as a failure to be conscious, but as a kind of blessed release. Oblivion from the pressures of modern life. Oblivion from the endless demands of family and work and society. Oblivion from the grinding, exhausting business of being a person in a world that never stopped asking for more. And the railway offered that oblivion freely, to anyone with a few pennies and a destination. It was democratic in a way that sleep medicine had never been. Rich or poor, educated or illiterate, nervous or calm, the train worked on everyone the same way. It rocked them, it rattled them, it released them. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this development. There were always critics, always voices warning about the dangers of sleeping on trains. What if you missed your stop? What if someone stole your belongings while you were unconscious? What if the very act of sleeping in public, surrounded by strangers, was somehow morally corrupting? The Victorians loved worrying about moral corruption. They could find it anywhere. But for the insomniac, for the exhausted soul who'd tried everything and found nothing that worked, these warnings were easy to ignore. Sleep was sleep. And if the railway could give it to them, they'd take it. Moral concerns, be damned. And take it they did. All across England, people started incorporating train naps into their routines. Not journeys to anywhere in particular, just short rides out of the city and back again, timed specifically to catch a few minutes of unconsciousness. The railway companies noticed. They didn't quite know what to make of it. Were these people travelers or patients? But they were happy to sell tickets either way. Your doctor, if you had one, who kept up with the latest trends, would have known all this. He would have understood, at least in a general way, why the train worked, and he would have prescribed it with confidence, sending you off to the station with instructions that were about to get surprisingly specific. Let's talk about that prescription in more detail, because it wasn't as simple as go take a train ride. Victorian doctors, for all their occasional eccentricity, took their treatments seriously. They understood that dosage mattered, that timing mattered, that the specific conditions of your journey could mean the difference between genuine rest and a wasted afternoon spent jolting awake at every station. So imagine yourself back in that consulting room. The doctor has made his recommendation. You've agreed to try it. What do you have to lose? And now he's reaching for a fresh sheet of paper, dipping his pen in ink, preparing to write something that will look, to modern eyes, utterly bizarre. First, he specifies the destination. This isn't arbitrary. He's not sending you to visit relatives or see a sight. He's choosing a station based on travel time. Too short a journey, say, less than 20 minutes, and you might not have time to fall asleep before you're jerked awake again. Too long, more than 2 hours on, you risk falling into deep sleep, the kind that leaves you groggy and disoriented when you finally arrive. The ideal, according to the medical journals of the time, was somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, long enough to cycle through the early stages of sleep, not long enough to crash into the depths. Next, he considers the time of day. This is crucial. A morning journey, he explains, might help if your insomnia is the kind that leaves you exhausted but unable to nap. The early light, the freshness of the day, the sense of purpose, all of this can work with the train's rhythm to ease you into a light, refreshing sleep. But if your problem is the opposite, you lie awake at night, your mind racing through every mistake you've ever made, then an evening journey might serve you better. The gathering darkness outside the window, the gradual dimming of the world, the sense of the day ending, all of this prepares your brain for the longer sleep to come. He might even prescribe a specific class of carriage, based on your personality. If you're the nervous type, easily startled, prone to jumping at sudden sounds, he'll send you first class. The enclosed compartments, the padded seats, the relative quiet, all of this cushions your jangled nerves, gives you a space where you can feel safe enough to let go. But if your problem is the opposite, you're the type who lies in bed thinking, spiraling into increasingly elaborate fantasies about everything that could possibly go wrong, then third class is your prescription. The chaos, the discomfort, the sheer overwhelming sensory input, it drowns out your thoughts, the way a loud noise drowns out a whisper. And then there's the question of companions. Should you travel alone or with someone? The doctors debated this. Some argued that solitude was essential, that the presence of another person, event a silent one, created a kind of social vigilance that kept the brain partly awake. Others countered that a trusted companion could actually enhance the effect, providing a sense of security that allowed deeper rest. There were even experiments with trained nurses accompanying patients on prescribed journeys, monitoring their sleep, recording the duration and quality, adjusting future prescriptions based on the data. In this imaginary consultation, are given specific instructions. You're to travel from London to a town called Croydon, about 45 minutes, depending on the engine and the tracks. You're to take the 2:15 train, third class, and you're to sit on the left side of the carriage, facing forward. Why the left side? Because the afternoon sun, at that time of year, will be on the right. And the doctor wants you in shadow, not squinting through the glare. Why facing forward? Because motion sickness, he explains, can disrupt sleep. And most people handle forward-facing travel better than backward. You take the paper. You thank him. You pay his fee, which, by the way, is not insignificant, and you walk out into the London afternoon, clutching your prescription like a talisman. The day of your journey arrives. You're nervous. You've never done anything like this before. Taking medicine is one thing, you swallow it. You wait. It works or it doesn't. But this requires you to participate, to go somewhere, to surrender to an experience that feels almost like a performance. You arrive at the station early, because Victorian stations were chaotic places, and missing your train would mean missing your prescription. You buy your ticket third class, as ordered, and you find your platform. The engine is already there, hissing and sighing like a sleeping beast. Smoke rises from its chimney, carrying that familiar smell of coal and oil and hot metal. You board. You find a seat on the left side, facing forward, and you wait. Other passengers fill the carriage, A woman with a basket of live chickens. The chickens are not happy about this. A man in work clothes, his hands stained with something you don't want to identify. A child who keeps staring at you with the unnerving intensity that only children possess. You feel absurdly self-conscious. What are you doing here? What will these people think if you fall asleep? Will they try to wake you, steal from you, report you to someone? But then the whistle blows. The train lurches, and something shifts inside you. The rhythm starts immediately. Clack, 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 clack. Clack, clack, and it's surprisingly hard to resist. Your body wants to sync with it. Your breathing wants to match it. Your eyelids, despite your best efforts, want to close. You think about what the doctor said. Surrender, he told you. Don't fight it. Let the train do its work, so you try. You let your shoulders drop. You let your head tilt slightly toward the window. You let the clattering rhythm fill your mind, pushing out the thoughts that usually crowd there, the worries about money, the regrets about conversations, the endless planning for futures that may never arrive. The chickens are still clucking. The child is still staring. The man's mysterious stains are still within smelling distance, but none of it matters as much as it did a few minutes ago. The train is carrying you, literally and metaphorically. You're not in control, and for once, that feels like relief. You don't remember falling asleep, but you do remember waking up slowly, gently, as the train slows for Croydon Station. You feel disoriented but calm. Your mouth is dry. Your neck is stiff, but your mind, for the first time in weeks, is quiet. You step off the train. You have 45 minutes before the return journey. The doctor prescribed a round trip, with time to walk around the station and let the sleep settle before the ride back. You buy a cup of tea from a vendor. You watch other passengers come and go, and you think about what just happened. It worked. Against all logic, against all expectation, the train actually worked. You'll do this again, many times, probably. You'll become one of those people. The railway companies start to notice, the ones who buy tickets to nowhere, who ride out and back without ever leaving the station, who treat the train as a kind of moving bedroom. And you'll tell your doctor, at your next visit, that his prescription was the strangest but most effective treatment you've ever tried. But you're not alone in this. All over Victorian England, other insomniacs are having the same experience. The railway, built to move goods and people, has accidentally become a sleep clinic, and the doctors, always watching, always theorizing, are about to take this discovery in directions nobody could have predicted. You've had your first prescribed journey now, and something has shifted. The world looks slightly different, or maybe you're the one who's different. Either way, you find yourself thinking about the next ride before you've even fully recovered from the first. There's a pull there, a strange magnetism. The train has become more than transportation. It's become a kind of ritual. And rituals, as any Victorian would tell you, matter. They give structure to experience. They transform the mundane into the meaningful. So let's walk through the ritual of a prescribed railway sleep, step by step, because the details matter. The details are what separate a simple nap from a genuine medical treatment. You arrive at the station at the prescribed time. Let's say it's evening now. The doctor has adjusted your prescription based on your feedback, moving you from afternoon to dusk. The light is different at this hour, softer. The gas lamps are beginning to flicker to life along the platform, casting pools of warm yellow in the growing darkness. The air smells different, to cooler, cleaner somehow, as if the city itself is settling down after the chaos of the day. You've learned a few things since your first journey. You know now to dress for the experience. A scarf, because the third-class carriages get cold after dark. A hat you can pull down over your eyes to block the light. Clothes that don't require constant adjustment. Nothing too tight or restrictive. You've essentially invented, without realizing it, the concept of sleepwear for public transport, a category that won't exist for another 100 years. You board the train. You've learned to choose your spot carefully. Near the middle of the carriage, you've discovered, the motion is most regular, less of the jerking at the front, less of the swaying at the back. You've also learned to avoid seats near the door, because the constant opening and closing, the bursts of cold air and noise, will pull you back from the edge of sleep, just when you're closest to letting go. The other passengers board. This is the evening train, so the crowd is different from the afternoon. Workers heading home after long shifts, women returning from shopping expeditions in the city, a few people like you suspect fellow insomniacs on prescribed journeys. Though none of you acknowledge this to each other, there's an unspoken agreement, a kind of privacy in public. You don't ask why someone's on this train. They don't ask you. The whistle blows. The train lurches, and the ritual begins. Now, here's something the doctors noticed but couldn't quite explain. The collective nature of railway sleep. When one person in a carriage starts to nod off, it seems to spread. Like yawning. Like laughter, sleep has a social contagion to it. You've experienced this yourself without realizing it. The man across from you, the one with the day's exhaustion written in every line of his face, his eyes close, his head drops, and something about seeing him surrender makes it easier for you to surrender too. The Victorians had a theory about this. Of course, they called it sympathetic exhaustion. The idea that witnessing fatigue in others somehow triggers fatigue in yourself. It's not entirely wrong. As it turns out, modern neuroscience has identified mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when you do something and when you watch someone else do it. These neurons are involved in empathy, in learning, in all kinds of social behaviors, and they might also be involved in sleep. Watch someone else drift off, and your brain, at some unconscious level, starts preparing to do the same. So there you are, in a carriage full of strangers, all of you slowly sinking into the same rhythm, the clack-clack of the wheels, the hiss of steam, the occasional shout from outside as the train passes through a station, and underneath it all, the collective breathing of a dozen people, gradually slowing, deepening, synchronizing in ways none of you will ever consciously notice. You close your eyes. The world behind your eyelids is dark shot with orange from the gas lamps on the platform. You can feel the vibration of the train through the bench, through your bones, through your very thoughts. It's as if the rhythm has bypassed your senses entirely and is working directly on your nervous system, massaging it into submission. The man next to you shifts in his sleep and leans against your shoulder. On your first journey, this would have startled you, annoyed you. Now, it's almost comforting. His weight is warm, solid, real. It anchors you. It reminds you that you're not alone in this strange ritual, that other bodies are surrendering alongside yours, that the train is carrying all of you together into the same temporary oblivion, and then you're gone. Not asleep. Exactly asleep is too simple a word for what happens. You're somewhere between, somewhere in the margins. You're aware of the train, distantly, the way you're aware of your own heartbeat when you're not thinking about it. You're aware of the other passengers, their breathing, their occasional murmurs, but you're not thinking about any of it. You're not thinking at all. This is the state that doctors are really after. Not deep sleep, not the kind that leaves you groggy and disoriented, but this hovering on the edge, this gentle drift. They call it the borderland, and they believe, with some justification, that it's more restorative than full unconsciousness. In the borderland, your mind rests without shutting down completely. Your thoughts settle without disappearing. You emerge from it refreshed, but not confused. Calm, but not dull. The train slows. You feel the change in the rhythm before you consciously register it, the clack-clack spacing out, the vibration easing, the whole machine sighing toward stillness. You open your eyes. The man who is leaning on you is already straightening, adjusting his clothes, preparing to leave. The woman with the shopping baskets is gathering her packages. The child who stared at you on your first journey, not the same child. A different one is asleep in its mother's arms. And for a moment, you feel a strange kinship with that child. You've both been carried. You've both been held. You step off the train. The platform is busier now, full of people ending their journeys, finding their connections, heading home. But you're not heading home yet. Your prescription includes a walk. Time to let the sleep settle before the return trip. So you walk. You find a bench away from the crowd. You watch the trains come and go, and you think about nothing in particular, which is, for an insomniac, a kind of miracle. When you board the return train, something interesting happens. The rhythm that eased you into sleep on the outward journey now feels different, familiar, almost like coming home. You settle into your set left side, middle of the carriage, facing forward, and the clack-clack starts again, and you realize, with a small shock of recognition, that you've learned something. Your body has learned something. It now associates this rhythm with rest, with safety, with the borderland. The train has trained you, almost without your knowledge, to respond to its cues. This is what the doctors are starting to understand. The railway isn't just a sleeping pill. It's a teacher. It's showing your brain, over and over, what surrender feels like. And eventually, hopefully, your brain will learn to find that surrender on its own. Without the train, without the motion, without the rhythm. Eventually, you might sleep in your own bed again. But that's for later. For now, the train is enough. The train is everything. And as the return journey carries you back toward London, you close your eyes and let it carry you one more time. But let's pause here for a moment, because there's something we haven't talked about yet. Something that might change how you imagine these Victorian railway journeys. Something about speed, or rather, the lack of it. When you think of a train, you probably think of speed. Modern trains can push 100 miles an hour easily. eating up distance like a child eating cake. But Victorian trains, especially in the early decades, were not fast, not by your standards, not even close. The average speed of a passenger train in 1850 was around 30 miles per hour. On a good day, on straight tracks, with a strong engine and a light load. And that's the average, which means there were plenty of moments when the train was moving much slower, crawling through stations, creeping over poorly laid track, grinding to a halt while cows were cleared from the line, which happened more often than you'd think. So imagine your prescribed journey again, but this time with the speed properly in mind. You're not hurtling through the landscape. You're rambling. You're strolling. You're moving at roughly the speed of a modern car on a suburban street, assuming that car is being driven by someone who's in no particular hurry and keeps stopping to admire the scenery. This changes everything about the experience. The rhythm of the wheels, for one thing, is slower, more deliberate. The clack-clack comes at a pace you could almost tap with your foot. A lazy heartbeat rather than a frantic pulse. The landscape outside doesn't blurt drifts. You can pick out individual trees, individual houses, individual people standing by the track watching the train pass. You can see their faces. Sometimes, you can see them seeing you. And this slowness, this deliberate pace, is actually crucial to the sleep-inducing effect. Think about it. If the train were hurtling along at modern speeds, your brain would be on alert. Things would be happening too fast. Your survival instincts, ancient and stubborn, would keep you at least partly awake, watching for danger, ready to react. But at 30 miles an hour, the speed of a running horse, the speed your ancestors have understood for thousands of years, there's no threat. Your brain categorizes it as safe, familiar, nothing to worry about. The Victorians noticed this too, though they explained it differently. They talked about the unhurried nature of railway travel, the way it matched the natural rhythms of the human body. Your heartbeat, your breathing, your walking pulse, of these operate in a certain range. A range that happens to align quite nicely with the speed of an early locomotive. The train, in other words, wasn't forcing your body to adapt to it, it was adapting to your body. But here's where it gets really interesting. That slowness, that unhurried pace, created something unexpected, a distorted sense of time. Passengers on these early trains often reported that journeys felt longer than they actually were. Not in a bad way, not in the way a traffic jam feels long, but in a dreamy, stretched-out way. An hour on the train could feel like 2 hours, or 3, or an entire afternoon. Time seemed to expand, to soften, to lose its sharp edges. And for the insomniac, this was a gift. Because one of the tortures of sleeplessness is the way time stretches when you're lying awake at night. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like forever. The clock on your nightstand becomes an enemy, each tick a reminder of rest you're not getting. But on the train, that same stretched time felt different. It felt like a vacation from the clock. It felt like permission to stop counting. You've experienced this yourself, probably, without realizing it. Think of a long car journey when you were a child, lying in the back seat, watching the world go by. The miles seemed endless. The trip seemed to last forever. And yet, that endlessness was comforting, not frustrating. It was a break from the rushed, scheduled, timed existence that normally governed your life. On the train, you were nowhere and everywhere at once. You had left one place but hadn't arrived at another. You existed in the between, and the between had its own rules. The Victorians had a word for this state. They called it suspension. Not suspension as in hanging, but suspension as in pausing, as in stopping the usual flow of things. On the train, your life was suspended. Your worries were suspended. Your relationship with time itself was suspended. And in that suspension, sleep could find you. Of course, suspension had its downsides too. The same stretched time that felt so restful could also feel, for some passengers, deeply unsettling. There are accounts of Victorian travelers experiencing what they called railway terror, a kind of anxiety attack brought on by the combination of motion, noise, and the strange feeling of being neither here nor there. For these unfortunates, the train was anything but sleep. It was a nightmare on wheels. But for you, the prescribed insomniac, the experience is different. You've been taught, by your doctor and by your own practice, to lean into the suspension, to welcome it, to let it carry you wherever it wants to go. And where it wants to go, it turns out, is somewhere very old, somewhere deep in your brain, somewhere that remembers what it felt like to be carried, to be held, to be moved through the world without any effort of your own. The train rocks. The landscape drifts. The rhythm continues its gentle insistence. And you, suspended between departure and arrival, between waking and sleeping, between then and now, you let yourself be carried. Now, Here's a detail the history books don't always mention. Those early trains, slow as they were, had another feature that contributed to their sleep-inducing power. They stopped. A lot. At every little station, every junction, every place where a farmer might want to load a few crates of vegetables. The journey from London to Croydon, which today takes about 15 minutes on a fast train, might have taken an hour or more in 1850, with half a dozen stops along the way. And those stops, you might think, would disrupt sleep. Each time the train slowed and halted, each time the rhythm stopped and the silence rushed in, surely that would wake you, jerk you back to consciousness, ruin the whole effect. But here's the strange thing. For many passengers, the stops actually enhanced the sleep, because the silence, when it came, was so complete. So sudden, so different from the constant clatter that preceded it. That silence, that absence of rhythm, was like a deep breath after running. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. And in that punctuation, sleep deepened. You felt this yourself. Maybe, the way a train stopping at a station can actually pull you deeper into sleep. As if the sudden quiet gives your brain permission to let go completely. The rhythm stops, but your relaxation doesn't. Instead, it settles. It spreads. It fills the silence like water filling a hollow. Then the whistle blows. The train lurches back into motion. The rhythm starts again. And you, still sleeping, barely notice. You've learned, by now, to trust the train, to let it do what it does without interference from your conscious mind. You're in its hands now, completely and willingly. And that willingness is the whole point. The doctors understood this, at least partly. They knew that the key to the railway's effectiveness wasn't just the motion or the sound or the rhythm. It was the trust, the surrender, the willingness to let something else take over. And they knew, too, that this trust had to be learned. It didn't come naturally to most people. Especially not to the anxious, overthinking insomniacs who filled their consulting rooms. That's why they prescribed multiple journeys. That's why they adjusted the dosage based on feedback. They were teaching you, gradually, patiently, how to let go. And the train, slow and steady and endlessly patient, was their teaching tool. Now, let's shift our attention to the other end of the carriage. Because while you've been dozing in third class, surrounded by chickens and strangers and the honest smells of working-class England, there's another world entirely on the same train, a world of velvet and silence, a world where sleep comes differently, if it comes at all. First-class carriages in the Victorian era were something to behold, where you're sitting on bare wood, they're sinking into deep upholstery, where you're breathing coal smoke through gaps in the walls. They're enclosed in compartments designed to keep the elements and the lower classes at a comfortable distance, where you're packed in with a dozen strangers, they're traveling alone, or with family, or with servants whose job is to anticipate every need before it's even expressed. The first-class compartment is a room on wheels. It has curtains you can draw for privacy. It has cushions you can arrange for comfort. It has, in some of the more luxurious trains, actual beds, fold-down sleeping berths that transform the compartment into a miniature bedroom. If you're wealthy enough, you can travel through the night lying flat, wrapped in sheets, rocked by the same motion that rocks you in third class, but with none of the discomfort. You might think this would be the ultimate sleep prescription. A real bed on a real train, combining the best of both worlds. And some Victorian doctors did prescribe first-class travel for their wealthiest patients. But here's the complication. The very comforts that make first class appealing also undermine the railway's sleep-inducing power. Because comfort, it turns out, isn't the same as surrender. Think about it. In first class, you're still in control. You have curtains you can open or close. You have cushions you can arrange. You have space to move, to stretch, to adjust your position whenever you want. And that control, that constant possibility of adjustment, keeps your brain at least partly engaged. You're not fully surrendering to the experience because you don't have to. You can always make it better. In third class, you have no such options. The bench is hard and will remain hard. The cold air finds you no matter how you position yourself. The stranger next to you will lean on your shoulder whether you want them to or not. You have no choice but to accept what the train gives you. And that lack of choice, that forced acceptance, is exactly what your overactive mind needs. The doctors noticed this too, though they phrased it in terms of moral treatment. The idea that discomfort could be therapeutic, that facing unpleasant circumstances with patience and resignation was good for the character, and, by extension, good for the nerves. Send a wealthy insomniac to third class, some physicians argued, and you'd cure not only their sleeplessness, but their excessive delicacy, their dependence on comfort, their inability to cope with the minor hardships of ordinary life. But the wealthy patients rarely agreed. They'd paid for first class, and first class they would have, so the railway sleep phenomenon divided along class lines, as everything in Victorian England divided along class lines. The poor slept on trains because they had no choice. The rich slept on trains despite having every choice, and both groups, in their different ways, contributed to the growing body of knowledge about what the railway could do. Now, imagine yourself as one of those wealthy patients. You've heard about this railway treatment from your doctor, probably the same doctor who attends your wife's nervous complaints and your children's coughs. You're skeptical. You've never traveled third class in your life, and you're not about to start, but you're also desperate. You've tried everything else, so you agree to try the train, but on your own terms. You arrive at the station in your finest clothes. A porter carries your luggage, not that you need luggage for a short journey, but old habits die hard. You board the first-class carriage and settle into your compartment. The seats are plush, almost absurdly so. There's a small table with a lamp. There's a window you can open just a crack if the air grows stuffy. There's even a bell to summon the guard if you need anything. The train departs. The motion begins, and you wait for sleep to find you. But it doesn't. Or not in the way you expected. The rhythm is there. The same rhythm that works so well in third class. But here, muffled by upholstery and distance, it's softer, less insistent. You can feel it more than hear it. A vibration through the cushions rather than a clatter in your ears. And somehow, that softness makes it less effective. Your brain doesn't have to surrender to it, because it's not demanding your attention. It's just background, easily ignored. You close your eyes. You arrange the cushions. You adjust the curtain. You try every position you can think of. And through it all, you remain stubbornly, frustratingly awake. The train is doing its part, but you're not doing yours. You're not surrendering because you don't know how. Comfort has never required you to learn. This is the paradox at the heart of Victorian railway sleep. The very conditions that make third class miserable are the conditions that make it work. The discomfort demands your surrender. The lack of control forces your acceptance. And your brain, overwhelmed by sensations it can't escape, finally does what it should have done all along. Let's go. For the wealthy patient, learning to let go requires a different kind of education. Some doctors prescribed gradual exposure. Start with second class, they suggested, then work your way down. Others recommended combining first-class travel with other forms of deprivation, like opening the window wide even on cold days, or sitting on the floor instead of the cushions. The goal was always the same: to recreate, in the midst of comfort, the conditions of surrender that came so naturally to the poor. But most wealthy patients never learned. They continued to ride first class, continued to struggle with sleep, continued to wonder why the railway worked for everyone but them. And the doctors, inevitably, began to prescribe something else entirely, not the train itself, but the memory of the train, the anticipation of it, the planning and preparation that preceded each journey. Because here's something that Victorians understood that we often forget. The prescription starts before you board. The moment your doctor writes that ticket, the moment you decide to follow his advice, the treatment has already begun. Your mind starts preparing for sleep hours before you reach the station. You think about the journey. You imagine the rhythm. You anticipate the surrender. And that anticipation, that mental rehearsal, is itself a kind of rest. By the time you actually board the train, you're already halfway to sleep. The train just finishes what your mind started. This is true whether you're in first class or third, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a seasoned traveler or a nervous fit. The ritual matters. The expectation matters. The whole elaborate performance of prescribed railway travel matters in ways that go far beyond the physical effects of motion and sound. And that's why, for all their differences, first-class and third-class passengers shared one thing in common. They both, in their own ways, were learning to sleep again. They were being retrained by the railway, taught by repetition and rhythm, to find rest in the most unlikely places. And some of them, the lucky ones, would eventually bring that learning home. They'd lie in their own beds, in their own rooms, and they'd close their eyes and imagine the train. They'd hear the rhythm in their memory. They'd feel the motion in their bones, and they'd sleep. But for those who couldn't make that leap, who needed the real train, the actual journey, the physical presence of the locomotive, the railway companies were happy to oblige. They sold more tickets. They ran more trains. They even, in some cases, advertised their services to the medical community, suggesting that a journey on their line was just what the doctor ordered. And the doctors, for their part, kept prescribing, kept observing, kept refining their understanding of what the railway could do, because this was still new territory, still unexplored, and every patient who boarded a prescribed train was adding to the collective knowledge about sleep, about surrender, about the strange relationship between motion and rest. But let's talk about something that surprised even the doctors, something they didn't expect when they started prescribing train rides, something about dreams. You've been taking these journeys for a while now. You've learned the rhythm. You've learned to surrender. You've even, on good days, managed to carry a little of that railway calm back into your ordinary life. But there's something else happening too, something you didn't anticipate. Your dreams have changed. Before the train prescriptions, your dreams when you had them were the usual chaos. Anxiety dreams about missed appointments. Strange fragments of the day's worries rearranged into nonsensical patterns. The occasional nightmare that left you gasping and awake at 3 a.m. Nothing special, nothing memorable. But now, after a railway sleep, your dreams are different. They're vivid in a way you've never experienced. They have a quality that feels almost real, almost tangible, and they often feature, in one form or another, the train. You're not alone in this. Victorian patients across the country reported similar experiences. They dreamed of endless tracks stretching to the horizon. They dreamed of stations that never arrived. They dreamed of being carried, always carried, through landscapes that shifted and changed, but never quite resolved into anything familiar. And these dreams, strange as they were, left them feeling oddly refreshed, as if the dreaming itself had been a kind of rest. The doctors noticed. They started asking questions. What were you dreaming about? How long did the dreams last? Did they feel pleasant or disturbing? And slowly, a theory began to emerge. The train, with its constant rhythm and motion, was doing something to the dreaming brain. It was providing a kind of soundtrack, a background narrative that the sleeping mind could weave into its own creations. The clack-clack of the wheels became footsteps in a dream. The swaying of the carriage became the motion of a ship at sea. The occasional whistle became a voice calling from somewhere just out of sight. And because the train's sensations were real actually happening to your sleeping body, they gave your dreams a solidity they usually lacked. A sense of place that made the dream world feel almost as real as the waking one. Modern sleep science has a name for this. It's called incorporation, the way external stimuli get woven into the fabric of your dreams. A door slamming becomes a gunshot in your nightmare. A drip of water becomes a leaky roof in your dream house. And the steady rhythm of a train becomes the heartbeat of whatever world your sleeping mind has constructed. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Victorians, without knowing anything about sleep stages or brainwaves, noticed something else about these railway dreams. They were often repetitive, almost hypnotic. Patients reported dreaming the same dream over multiple journeys, as if the train were leading them back to the same mental landscape night after night. Imagine that for a moment. You board the evening train to Croydon. You settle into your usual spot. The rhythm begins. You drift off. And there it is, again the same dream you had last week, and the week before. You're walking along an endless railway track, following it toward a horizon you never quite reach. The landscape around you is familiar but strange, like a place you once knew but can't quite remember. And you're not worried or anxious. You're just walking, just following, just letting the track lead you wherever it wants to go. This kind of repetitive dreaming, the doctors theorized, was therapeutic. It gave your mind a familiar place to rest, a predictable landscape to inhabit, instead of constructing new dream worlds every night, an exhausting process in itself. Your brain could simply return to the same one, settle in, and relax. The dream became a kind of home, a place you visited regularly, like a second residence in your own mind. And some patients reported something even stranger. They reported dreams that continued from one journey to the next, as if they were episodes in a serial story. Last week, you were walking along the track. This week, you've reached a station. Next week, you might board a train within the dream, a dream within a dream. Layers of railway reality folding into each other, like the compartments of a puzzle box. The doctors had no explanation for this. They could only observe and record, adding these accounts to the growing literature on railway sleep. But they suspected, correctly, that something important was happening. The train wasn't just inducing sleep. It was shaping it, molding it, giving it a form and structure that ordinary sleep, in the quiet of your own bedroom, rarely achieved. Now, here's a detail that might surprise you. Not all these railway dreams were pleasant. Some patients reported nightmares so vivid, so disturbing, that they refused to continue the treatment. They dreamed of crashes and derailments. They dreamed of being trapped in tunnels with no way out. They dreamed of the train carrying them past their station, past all stations. into an endless darkness from which there was no return. The doctors took these reports seriously. They adjusted prescriptions accordingly, shorter journeys for those prone to nightmares, daytime travel instead of evening, first class instead of third. They even experimented with something they called dream hygiene, which involved preparing the mind before the journey with calming thoughts and pleasant images. Don't think about crashes, they advised. Think about open fields. Think about sunlight. Think about whatever feels safe. And for most patients, this worked. The nightmares faded. The pleasant dreams took over. And the railway continued to do its work, carrying them night after night into a sleep that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely restful. But the dreams didn't stop being strange. They just became strange in a different way. Patients reported dreaming in rhythm, their thoughts and images syncing with the clack-clack of the wheels. They reported dreaming in motion, their dream selves always moving, always traveling, always following some path that never quite ended. They reported dreaming in ways that felt almost like trance states, like the hypnotic conditions that were also popular in Victorian medicine. And some of them, the most fortunate, reported something else. They reported dreams that continued after the journey ended, dreams that followed them home, dreams that lingered at the edges of waking consciousness, softening the transition back to ordinary life. They'd step off the train at Croydon, still half asleep, still half dreaming, and the dream would stay with them for hours. They'd walk through the station, and the dream would walk with them. They'd drink their tea, and the dream would flavor it. They'd board the return train, and the dream would welcome them back, as if it had been waiting all along. This, the doctors realized, was the real gift of railway sleep. Not just the rest it provided during the journey, but the way that rest lingered, the way it followed you home, the way it taught your brain, slowly and patiently, how to carry a little of that dreaminess into waking life. Because isn't that what insomniacs need most? Not just sleep, but the memory of sleep. Not just rest, but the feeling of having rested. Not just unconsciousness, but the sense that unconsciousness has left its mark on you, softened you, made you ready for whatever comes next. The train gave you that. The rhythm gave you that. And the dreams, strange, repetitive, hypnotic dreams, gave you something to carry with you when the journey ended. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because the Victorians, being Victorians, couldn't leave well enough alone. They had to categorize. They had to find the exceptions, the edge cases, the patients for whom the railway worked differently. And in doing so, they discovered something that seemed, at first, to contradict everything they'd learned. Some patients, it turned out, were prescribed not to sleep on the train. Think about that for a moment. You've spent weeks, maybe months, learning to surrender to the rhythm, to let the carriage rock you into oblivion. And now your doctor tells you that for your next journey, you must stay awake, must fight the very sleep you've been trying so hard to achieve, must resist the train instead of embracing it. It sounds like torture. And for some patients, it was, but for others, it was exactly what they needed. Let's back up and explain. The Victorian understanding of sleep was, as we've seen, a mix of observation and guesswork. They knew that sleep was important, but they didn't really know why. They knew that some people slept too much, and some too little. But they didn't have a clear framework for understanding the difference. And they knew that the railway could induce sleep. But they were just beginning to understand that it could do other things too. One of those other things was inducing something they called wakeful rest. A state of being fully conscious, but deeply relaxed. A state where your mind was alert, but your body was still. A state that, for certain patients, was more therapeutic than sleep itself. Who were these patients? They were the ones whose insomnia wasn't really about sleep. It was about anxiety, about the constant churn of worried thoughts that made relaxation impossible. For these people, falling asleep on the train wasn't the goal. The goal was to lie awake, surrounded by the rhythm, and learn that wakefulness didn't have to mean tension, that you could be conscious and calm at the same time, that your mind could keep running while your body finally rested. The doctors called this the railway rest cure, and they prescribed it for a specific subset of nervous patients. The instructions were precise. You were to board the train at a specific time, settle into your seat, and then do absolutely nothing. No reading, no conversation, no looking out the window, just sitting, breathing, feeling the motion, and letting your thoughts do whatever they wanted to do as long as you didn't try to control them. For the first few journeys, this was agony. Your mind, accustomed to constant stimulation, rebelled against the emptiness. Thoughts raced, worries multiplied. Every small anxiety became a major concern. You'd find yourself gripping the edge of the seat, jaw clenched, muscles tight, fighting the very rest you were supposed to be finding. But the train kept moving, the rhythm kept going, and slowly, over multiple journeys, something shifted. The thoughts were still there, but they didn't feel as urgent. The worries still came, but they didn't stay as long. You began to notice gaps between them, moments of silence in your own mind that you'd never experienced before. And in those gaps, you found something that felt almost like peace. This is the paradox at the heart of the railway rest cure. By not trying to sleep, you actually became more rested. By accepting wakefulness, you stopped fighting it. And in that acceptance, your body finally relaxed in ways that sleep alone could never provide. The doctors had a theory about this too. They called it the education of the will. The idea was that your conscious mind, your will, had become too dominant. It was always trying to control things, your thoughts, your feelings, your body's responses. And this constant effort at control was itself exhausting. The railway rest cure taught your will to step back, to let things happen without interference, to trust that your mind and body knew what to do without constant supervision. It was, in a sense, the opposite of everything Victorian culture valued. The Victorians prized self-control, discipline, the constant effort to improve yourself and your circumstances. But here was a treatment that said, in effect, stop trying so hard, let go, trust the process. It was almost radical, almost subversive, and it worked. For patients who could embrace it, the railway rest cure produced results that ordinary sleep prescriptions never could. They emerged from their journeys, not just rested, but changed. Something in their relationship with their own minds had shifted. They were less afraid of their thoughts, less desperate to control them, more willing to simply let them be. Now, here's a detail that might surprise you. Some doctors prescribed both kinds of railway treatment to the same patient's sleep journeys. On some days, wakeful rest on others. The idea was to train the mind in flexibility, to teach it that different states of consciousness were available, and that you could move between them without fear. Sleep when sleep was needed. Wakeful rest when that was more appropriate. An ordinary wakefulness for the rest of the time, now softened by the knowledge that rest was always possible. This kind of flexible prescribing was rare, but it points to something important about Victorian medicine at its best. For all their strange theories and limited knowledge, some doctors were remarkably attentive to their patients' individual needs. They didn't have a one-size-fits-all approach. They observed, they adjusted, they tailored their prescriptions to the person in front of them. And the railway, with its multiple classes and varied journey lengths and different times of day, gave them a flexible tool to work with, a treatment that could be adjusted in countless ways, a prescription that was never exactly the same twice. So imagine yourself as one of these patients, moving between sleep journeys and rest journeys, depending on what your doctor prescribes. Some days you board the train and surrender immediately, letting the rhythm carry you into unconsciousness within minutes. Other days you stay deliberately awake, watching your thoughts without engaging them, practicing the art of calm consciousness. Both experiences teach you something. Both change you in small but cumulative ways. And over time, you notice that the boundary between them is blurring. Even on sleep journeys, you're more aware now, more present. You notice the moment when consciousness begins to fade, the strange borderland where thoughts dissolve into dreams. Even on rest journeys, you're more relaxed, more willing to let your eyes close if they want to drift without quite sleeping. The two states are merging, becoming part of a single continuum that includes all the ways your mind can be. This is what the best Victorian doctors were aiming for. Not just sleep, but a transformed relationship with consciousness itself. Not just rest, but a new understanding of what rest could mean. The railway was their tool, but the real treatment was happening inside you. The train just provided the conditions. You did the rest. Or rather, you learned to stop doing, which was, in the end, the whole point. Now, let's follow one particular patient through their journey. Not you this time, but someone else. Someone whose story found its way into the medical journals of the time. A case study that Victorian doctors loved to discuss and debate. Let's call him Mr. Thompson, though that wasn't his real name. The Victorians were careful about privacy, even as they documented every detail of their patients' strange behaviors. Mr. Thompson came to his doctor in 1856 with a complaint. That would sound familiar to anyone who's ever struggled with sleep. He hadn't rested properly in 3 years. 3 years of lying awake, watching the ceiling, listening to the sounds of London at night. 3 years of tonics and tinctures, and cold baths and every remedy his wife could find in the growing literature of home health guides. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. He was a businessman. Mr. Thompson, successful enough to afford the best care, stressed enough to need it. His days were filled with ledgers and negotiations, and the constant pressure of keeping a Victorian enterprise afloat. His nights were filled with nothing but the echo of those days, his mind replaying every conversation, every decision, every potential mistake, until the small hours of the morning. His doctor, a progressive man named Dr. Reynolds, who had been following the railway literature with interest, made a suggestion. Not a cure, he emphasized, not a guarantee, but a possibility, a chance. Mr. Thompson was skeptical. He'd tried too many things that promised too much and delivered too little. But he was also desperate, and desperate people tried desperate measures, so he agreed to a prescription. A journey from London to Brighton about an hour each way, depending on the engine and the tracks. First class, because Mr. Thompson could afford it, and because Dr. Reynolds wanted to eliminate discomfort as a variable. Evening departure, because that was when Mr. Thompson's insomnia was worst. The first journey was a disaster. Mr. Thompson boarded the train with high hopes, and a pocket watch he checked every few minutes. The rhythm started, the motion began, and Mr. Thompson sat there, rigid as a statue, waiting for sleep to arrive. It didn't. Of course it didn't. Sleep doesn't respond to demands. It comes when it's ready, not when you are. He returned to Dr. Reynolds, frustrated and ready to give up. But Dr. Reynolds wasn't discouraged. He adjusted the prescription. Third class this time, he said, and a later train, and instructions to stop checking his watch. Mr. Thompson tried again. This time, the carriage was crowded. This time, the bench was hard. This time, the man next to him smelled of fish and fell asleep almost immediately, his head landing on Mr. Thompson's shoulder within minutes of departure. Mr. Thompson, remembering the doctor's instructions, didn't push him away, didn't stiffen, didn't resist. He just sat there, feeling the weight, feeling the rhythm, feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't quite name. He didn't sleep. Not really, but he came close. Closer than he'd been in years. For a few minutes, somewhere in the middle of the journey, his thoughts stopped their endless churning. For a few minutes, he existed in that borderland. That space between waking and sleeping, that the doctors found so therapeutic. And when the train arrived at Brighton, he stepped onto the platform feeling something he'd almost forgotten. Rested. That was the beginning. Over the following months, Mr. Thompson became a regular on the Brighton line. He took the evening train at least 3 times a week, sometimes more. He became known to the conductors, who would nod at him as he boarded and leave him alone in his chosen spot. He became a familiar figure to the other regular passengers, though none of them ever spoke. There was an understanding among them. They were all there for the same reason, even if they never acknowledged it. And something remarkable happened. Mr. Thompson started sleeping at home. Not every night, not perfectly, but more than he had in years. The train had taught him something that no tonic or tincture could teach. It had taught him how to let go. The medical journals loved this story. They reprinted it, analyzed it, used it as evidence in their ongoing debates about the railway cure. Some doctors argued that Mr. Thompson's improvement was purely psychological, that he'd been healed by belief, not by the train itself. Others insisted that the train's physical effects were real and measurable. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had passionate advocates, and neither side could prove the other wrong. But Mr. Thompson didn't care about the debates. He just kept riding the train. Even after he started sleeping better at home, he kept his regular journeys. They'd become part of his routine, part of his identity. He was, in a sense, addicted not to any substance, but to the experience itself, to the rhythm, to the surrender, to the strange peace that only came when the wheels were turning and the landscape was sliding past. And he was nowhere and everywhere at once. His wife didn't understand. She thought the journeys were a waste of time and money. His business partners thought he was eccentric. But Mr. Thompson didn't care about that either. He knew what the train gave him, and he wasn't about to give it up. Years later, when the railway cure had fallen out of fashion and new treatments had taken its place, Mr. Thompson was still riding, still taking the evening train to Brighton, still settling into his spot in third class. He'd never gone back to first. Even when he could afford it, still letting the rhythm carry him into that borderland where his mind could finally rest. He outlived his doctor. He outlived most of his business partners. He outlived the era that had first prescribed him that strange and wonderful treatment. But he never outlived his need for the train. And the train, for its part, never stopped carrying him. This is the thing about the railway cure that the medical journals sometimes missed. It wasn't just a treatment. It was a relationship. A bond between patient and machine. Between human and rhythm. Between the need for rest and the strange, clattering thing that provided it. Patients like Mr. Thompson didn't just use the train. They loved it. They depended on it. They built their lives around it in ways that went far beyond anything their doctors had intended. And the railway companies, ever practical, took notice. They saw the regulars. They saw the prescribed passengers, and they started thinking about how to serve them better, how to make the experience more comfortable without destroying what made it work, how to turn a medical accident into a permanent feature of railway life. But that's a story for another moment. For now, let's stay with Mr. Thompson on his evening journey. Watching him settle into his seat as the train pulls out of London, watch his face relax as the rhythm takes hold, watch his eyes close, slowly, gently, as if sleep were an old friend finally coming home. He's been doing this for decades now. He knows every sound, every jolt, every station along the line. He knows when to expect the long tunnel that plunges the carriage into darkness, when to expect the open stretches where the sky seems to go on forever. He knows the conductors by name, and they know him. They save his spot sometimes, if the carriage is crowded, and still, after all these years, the train works, still carries him into that borderland, still gives him what his own bed cannot. He's not cured. He stopped believing in cures long ago, but he's found something better than a cure. He's found a way to live with his sleeplessness, a way to make peace with it, a way to rest, even when he can't sleep. The train slows. Brighton approaches. Mr. Thompson opens his eyes, blinks once, twice, and then stands. He steps onto the platform, buys his return ticket, and waits for the journey back. In an hour, he'll do it all again, and the rhythm will carry him once more. Mr. Thompson's story spread, as such stories do, not through formal channels, though the medical journals certainly helped, but through the network of conversations that connected Victorian society. Patients told their doctors, doctors told their colleagues, friends told friends, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the railway cure began to seep into the culture. By the 1860s, you could see the effects everywhere. Railway stations had become, in a sense, unofficial clinics. The staff at major terminals like London Bridge or Paddington grew accustomed to a certain type of passenger, the ones who bought return tickets to nowhere in particular, who boarded with the look of people on a mission, who settled into their seats with a kind of practiced ease. The conductors learned to recognize them, learned to leave them alone, learned that some passengers weren't traveling to a destination but to a state of mind. The railway companies, ever alert to new sources of revenue, began to adapt. They introduced later trains to accommodate evening prescriptions. They added more third-class carriages to meet the demand from doctors who insisted on discomfort as part of the treatment. They even, in some cases, printed special tickets with space for a doctor's signature prescription. Pads in all but name. But the most interesting development happened outside the stations entirely. People started bringing the railway home. Not literally. You couldn't fit a locomotive in your parlor, but in spirit. They started recreating the conditions of the train in their own bedrooms. Think about what that meant. If the train's rhythm was therapeutic, then perhaps you could simulate that rhythm. If the train's motion was soothing, then perhaps you could find other ways to rock yourself to sleep. The Victorians, nothing if not inventive, began experimenting. Some tried rocking chairs, not the gentle rocking of a grandmother knitting, but a more vigorous motion, the kind that mimicked the jolt and sway of a third-class carriage. They'd sit in these chairs for an hour before bed, moving back and forth in a rhythm that matched the clack-clack they'd learned to love on their prescribed journeys. It looked absurd, and they knew it, but it worked for some. Others tried sound. They'd record well, they couldn't record, but they'd try to reproduce the noise of the train, humming, tapping, creating rhythms with whatever was at hand. There are accounts of Victorian insomniacs hiring musicians to play repetitive, train-like music outside their bedrooms at night. Imagine falling asleep to the sound of a cello, playing the same two notes over and over, accompanied by someone shaking a sheet of metal to simulate the rattle of wheels. It's almost funny, until you remember how desperate these people were. The most ambitious attempted to recreate the motion itself. There were experiments with beds on rockers, massive pieces of furniture that could be set in motion like a ship at sea. There were even, in a few wealthy households, rooms designed to sway. Imagine stepping into your bedroom and feeling the floor move beneath you, gently, like a train carriage that never arrived at its destination. None of these imitations worked as well as the real thing. The doctors knew this. The patients knew this. But they also knew that you couldn't spend your whole life on a train. Eventually, you had to come home. Eventually, you had to find a way to sleep in your own bed. So the imitations continued. The experiments multiplied. And slowly, over decades, a new understanding began to emerge. The train wasn't the only way to find rest. It was just the most reliable teacher. Once you'd learned what surrender felt like, you could start to find it in other places too. This is where your own story connects with Mr. Thompson's, and with all the other prescribed passengers of the Victorian era. You've been taking these journeys. You've learned the rhythm. You've learned to let go. And now, perhaps, you're ready to take the next step, to bring a little of the railway back with you. Imagine your bedroom now, transformed by what the train has taught you. The bed is still, it doesn't move. Can't move, but you've added something. A sound. A small machine that produces a steady, rhythmic noise. Not exactly the clack-clack of wheels on track, but close enough. Close enough to trigger the association, to remind your brain of the train. You lie down, the sound begins, and something in you relaxes. Just a little. Not completely, the bed is too still for that. Too quiet. But enough. Enough to remember what surrender feels like. Enough to let go. Just a fraction. Just for a moment. This is progress. This is what the doctors hoped for when they first started prescribing train rides. Not a lifetime of dependency on the railway, but a gradual transfer of learning. A slow migration of the sleep response from the train to the bedroom, from the external rhythm to the internal one. Some patients made this transition easily. After a few months of prescribed journeys, they found they could sleep at home again. The train had done its work, and they were free. Others, like Mr. Thompson, never quite made the leap. They kept riding, kept depending on the train, kept finding rest only when the wheels were turning. For them, the railway wasn't a teacher, it was a home, and they were happy to stay there. Both outcomes were acceptable to the Victorian medical establishment. The goal was rest, not independence. If you could rest at home, wonderful. If you could only rest on the train, well, that's what trains were for. The railway companies were happy to accommodate you, and your doctor was happy to keep prescribing. But there was another outcome too, one that the doctors didn't anticipate and didn't fully understand. Some patients, after months or years of prescribed journeys, found that they didn't need the train to sleep, but they also found that they didn't want to give it up. The journeys had become something more than medicine. They'd become a kind of ritual, a kind of meditation, a kind of time set aside from the pressures of ordinary life. These patients kept riding, even after they were cured. They became the regulars, the familiar faces, the ones the conductors nodded to as they boarded. They were no longer treating insomnia. They were treating something else, something harder to name. The exhaustion of being human, perhaps. The need for regular doses of surrender in a world that demanded constant effort. And in this, they anticipated something that wouldn't be fully understood for another century. The idea that rest isn't just something you do when you're broken. It's something you need regularly, preventively, whether you're sick or well. The idea that surrender isn't a weakness but a skill, something to be practiced, something to be maintained. The train gave them that practice. The rhythm gave them that skill, and they kept coming back for more, journey after journey, year after year, because they'd learned something that their doctors had only dimly perceived. Rest isn't a destination, it's a practice. And like any practice, it requires regular attention. So here you are, in your Victorian bedroom, listening to your makeshift train sound, feeling the ghost of motion in your still bed. You're not on the railway now, but the railway is in you. The rhythm has become part of your internal landscape. The surrender has become a skill you can access, at least a little, even without the train. It's not perfect. It's not as good as the real thing, but it's something. And for an insomniac, something is everything. But all good things come to an end, as the Victorians knew better than most. The railway cure, for all its popularity and all its apparent success, couldn't last forever. Changes were coming. Changes to the trains themselves. Changes to the culture. Changes to the very nature of sleep and how people thought about it. The first change was technological. By the 1870s and 1880s, trains were getting better, smoother, faster, more reliable. The tracks were laid with greater precision. The carriages were built with better suspension. The engines were more powerful and more consistent. All of which sounds like progress. And in most ways it was. But for the railway cure, it was a disaster. Remember what made those early trains so effective for sleep? The roughness, the unpredictability, the constant jolting that overwhelmed your senses and forced your brain to surrender. As trains became smoother, that effect diminished. The ride became more comfortable, which sounds like a good thing. But comfort wasn't what the insomniac needed. Comfort was what kept you awake, what allowed your thoughts to continue their endless churn. The new trains were too polite. They asked for your attention, instead of demanding your surrender. Doctors noticed this almost immediately. Patients who had done well on the older trains started reporting that the new ones didn't work as well. The rhythm was there, but it was softer. The motion was there, but it was gentler. The overwhelming sensory experience that had been the cure's secret ingredient was fading, replaced by something more refined and less effective. Some doctors tried to adapt. They prescribed older lines, where the tracks were still rough and the carriages still rattled. They prescribed specific trains known for their uncomfortable rides. They even, in some cases, advised patients to stand rather than sit, to maximize the jolting effect. But these were stopgaps, and everyone knew it. The railway cure was slowly being engineered out of existence. The second change was cultural. As the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian, attitudes toward sleep and health were shifting. The railway cure had always been a bit eccentric, a bit outside the mainstream of medical practice. Now it began to seem positively old-fashioned. New treatments were emerging: electrical therapies, hypnotism, the first primitive sleeping pills. Doctors had more options, and many of those options were easier to prescribe than a train ride. There was also a growing sense that the railway cure was somehow undignified. The idea of sleeping in public, surrounded by strangers, being rocked like a baby, it didn't fit with the increasingly sophisticated self-image of the modern patient. People wanted treatments that felt scientific, not folk remedies that felt like something your grandmother might suggest. The third change was perhaps the most significant. The very success of the railway cure had made it unnecessary. By teaching people how to sleep again, by training their brains to find rest in motion and rhythm, it had gradually reduced the population of insomniacs who needed it. The patients who could be cured were cured. The ones who couldn't, like Mr. Thompson, kept riding, but they were a dwindling minority. The railway cure was becoming a niche treatment, a footnote in medical history. And yet, it didn't disappear entirely. Not quite. Traces of it lingered in unexpected places. Think about the rocking chair, which remained a staple of bedrooms and nurseries, long after the railway cure faded. Think about the lullaby, with its repetitive rhythm and soothing cadence. Think about white noise machines, which would be invented decades later, but which served essentially the same purpose as the train's clatter. The railway cure didn't die. It just diffused. It spread out into the culture, becoming part of the background, part of the way people thought about sleep without even realizing where those thoughts came from. There's a particular irony here. The very improvements that killed the railway cure: the smoother tracks. The more comfortable carriages made trains more appealing for ordinary travel. More people rode them. More people experienced that gentler rhythm, that softer motion. And some of those people, without any prescription, without any medical intent, found themselves growing drowsy on their journeys. Not as reliably as the old days, not as deeply, but enough to notice, enough to wonder. The railway had become a sleeping aid by accident. And it remained one by accident. Even after the formal cure had faded, people still napped on trains, still dozed off during their commutes, still woke up disoriented at their destination, wondering where the time had gone. The cure was gone, but the effect remained, weaker, but present, a ghost of what it had been. And in that ghost, something of the original railway cure lived on. The same rhythm, the same surrender, the same strange gift of rest in the most unlikely places. Now, imagine yourself as one of those later passengers, not a prescribed patient, just an ordinary traveler. You board the train for a journey that has nothing to do with sleep: a visit to family, a business trip, a holiday by the sea. You settle into your seat, modern and comfortable, and you watch the landscape begin to move. You're not trying to sleep. You're not thinking about sleep. You're reading a book, or looking at the view, or making mental notes about whatever awaits you at your destination. But somewhere along the way, something happens. Your eyes grow heavy. Your head nods. The book slips from your fingers, and you sleep. Not deeply, not for long, but enough. Enough to wake feeling slightly refreshed, slightly disoriented, slightly puzzled by what just happened. You didn't mean to sleep. You didn't think you were tired, but the train had other ideas. That's the ghost of the railway cure. That's the echo of all those prescribed journeys, all those desperate insomniacs, all those doctors who thought they'd found something magical. The train still does what it always did. It just does it more quietly now. And somewhere, in the back of your mind, an ancient connection stirs. The same connection that rocked you before you were born. The same connection that carried Mr. Thompson through decades of sleepless nights. The same connection that Victorian doctors stumbled upon and then, gradually, forgot. You're part of that story now. Every time you nod off on a train, every time the rhythm claims you without your permission, you're continuing a tradition that stretches back more than a century. You're proving, all over again, that the Victorians were onto something. That the railway really is a sleeping pill on wheels. That some cures never die, they just become part of the background. part of the way things are, until we forget they were ever discovered at all. And this brings us, finally, to you, lying in your bed, in your room, in whatever time zone you're currently occupying. You've traveled with me through Victorian England, through rattling carriages and crowded platforms, through the strange and wonderful story of how doctors once prescribed train rides for insomnia. But now it's time to come back, time to connect that story to the room you're in right now. Because here's the thing, you have access to the railway cure, not the original version. You can't hop on a steam train to Croydon at 2:15 a.m. And even if you could, it wouldn't work the same way. The trains are too smooth now, too comfortable, too polite. But you have something else, something the Victorians could only dream of. You have the sound. Think about all those white noise apps on your phone, all those YouTube videos of train rides that go on for hours, all those machines sold specifically to help people sleep, generating the exact frequencies that calm the anxious brain. They're all descendants of the railway cure, all direct lines from those first accidental discoveries on Victorian trains. When you play the sound of rain, or ocean waves, or a distant locomotive, you're doing exactly what those early passengers did. You're filling the silence with rhythm. You're giving your brain something to hold on to, something repetitive and predictable, something that drowns out the sudden noises and the wandering thoughts. You're creating, in your own bedroom, a version of that third-class carriage. And the motion, you don't have the motion. Your bed is still. But here's a secret the Victorians discovered. The sound alone does much of the work. Not all of it. The rocking helps. The jolting helps. The complete sensory overwhelm of a real train journey is hard to replicate. But the sound alone is surprisingly effective. It taps into the same neural pathways, triggers the same relaxation response. Not as powerfully, perhaps, but powerfully enough. There's another connection to something the Victorians couldn't have anticipated, but would have loved. The modern experience of watching videos before bed, scrolling through endless content, letting your mind be carried from one thing to the next, has its own hypnotic quality. It's not the same as the train's rhythm, but it's related. It's a kind of surrender, a letting go of control, a willingness to be carried out of course. The screens themselves work against sleep. The blue light, the engaging content, the way your brain stays active even as your thumb keeps scrolling. But the impulse is the same. The desire to be taken somewhere else, to escape the confines of your own thoughts, to find a rhythm that carries you away from worry and into rest. The Victorians would have understood this impulse perfectly. They might even have approved of it, while cautioning against the screens. They were, after all, experts in the relationship between technology and rest. They'd seen how the railway, the great technological wonder of their age, could both disrupt sleep and restore it. They knew that every new invention carried both promise and peril. So here you are, in your modern bedroom, with your modern devices, trying to find the rest that always seems just out of reach. You've tried the apps. You've tried the white noise. You've tried everything your culture offers for the eternal problem of sleeplessness. And maybe, just maybe, some of it has worked. Maybe you found your own version of the railway cure. But here's what the Victorian story adds to your modern experience. It gives you permission. Permission to embrace the strange and seemingly irrational methods that work for you. Permission to surrender to rhythm, to sound, to the simple mechanical comfort of something repetitive and predictable. Permission to stop fighting and let yourself be carried. Because that's what the railway cure really was. In the end, not a medical treatment in the modern sense, not a pill with a known mechanism and a predictable outcome. It was an invitation to let go, an invitation to trust that your body knew how to rest, if only you'd get out of its way, an invitation to become, for a little while, a passenger in your own life. The train provided the conditions, the rhythm, the motion, the surrender, but the sleep itself came from you, from somewhere deep in your brain. Somewhere ancient and wise. Somewhere that remembered how to rest, even when your conscious mind had forgotten. That's still true today. All the apps and machines and videos in the world can't make you sleep. They can only create the conditions. They can only invite. The rest is up to you. Or rather, it's up to something in you that isn't quite you, something older and simpler, and more patient than the anxious voice that keeps you awake at night. The Victorians understood this, at least dimly. They didn't have the neuroscience to explain it, but they had the experience. They'd seen it happen, again and again, in rattling carriages and crowded third-class compartments. They'd watched insomniacs surrender to the rhythm and find, for the first time in years, the rest they'd been chasing. And now you've seen it too. You've traveled with them. You've sat in those carriages, felt those jolts, heard that clatter. You've met Mr. Thompson and Dr. Reynolds and all the other characters in this strange and wonderful story. You've learned what they learned. That sleep is a gift, not an achievement. That surrender is a skill, not a weakness. That sometimes the best thing you can do is stop trying so hard and let the rhythm carry you where it will. So as we approach the end of this journey together, I want you to think about what you'll carry with you. Not just the facts, the dates, and names, and details that historians love, but the feeling, the sense of what it was like to be there, in those carriages, on those journeys. Finding rest in the most unlikely places. Because that feeling is still available to you, still accessible, still waiting in the rhythm of a white noise machine, the sway of a rocking chair, the simple act of letting go. The railway cure didn't die, it just changed form. It became part of the background, part of the culture, part of the countless small ways we find rest in a restless world. And now it's part of you too, part of your story, part of the long, strange history of human beings trying to sleep and finding, in the most unexpected places, the rest they seek. So, here we are, the last leg of the journey, the final station before we part ways. You've been with me through rattling carriages and smoky platforms, through the strange history of Victorian medicine and the even stranger story of how doctors once prescribed train rides for insomnia. You've met the patients, the physicians, the conductors who witnessed this peculiar chapter in the long human struggle for rest. And now it's time to bring you home. Let's take a moment to let it all settle, to let the rhythm of this story do what the train's rhythm did for those Victorian insomniacs, carry you gently toward a place of rest. Think about what we've discovered together. That sleep isn't something you can force. That surrender isn't weakness but wisdom. That the most effective treatments sometimes come from the most unlikely places, a wooden bench in a smoky carriage. A journey to nowhere in particular. A rhythm so insistent it drowns out the endless chatter of an anxious mind. The Victorians stumbled onto something profound. Even if they never fully understood it, they recognized that the conditions for sleep aren't always the conditions we expect. Not silence, but sound. Not stillness, but motion. Not control, but its opposite. They learned, through trial and error, through observation and accident, that the path to rest sometimes runs through places that seem anything but restful. And they left us a gift, a legacy, a reminder that we don't have to fight so hard, that we can let the rhythm carry us. That surrender is available, always, if we're willing to accept it. Now, as you lie in your own bed, in your own room, in your own time, I want you to imagine that you're on one of those Victorian trains, not the first-class carriage with its velvet cushions and drawn curtains, not even the second class with its wooden benches and slightly better company. The third class, the crowded one, the one where the bench is hard and the air smells of coal and the stranger next to you is already asleep, their head resting gently on your shoulder. Feel the motion, that steady, rhythmic rocking, the sway of the carriage as it rounds a bend, the jolt as it passes over a switch, the gentle lurch as it slows for a station. Feel it in your bones, in your breath, in the slow relaxation of muscles you didn't realize were tense. Hear the sound, the clack-clack of wheels on track, the hiss of steam from the engine, the distant whistle as the train announces its presence to the night. Not harsh sounds, not jarring, but rhythmic, predictable, safe. The kind of sound that tells your brain, over and over, that everything is as it should be, that there's nothing to watch for, nothing to fear, nothing to do but rest. See the darkness behind your eyelids, the occasional flicker of a gas lamp on the platform as you pass through a station, the deeper darkness of the countryside between towns, the way the world outside becomes a blur, a suggestion, a soft impression of fields and trees and distant lights. Nothing that demands your attention, nothing that requires a response. And feel yourself letting go. Not all at once. Surrender never works that way, but gradually, gently, in layers. First, the tension in your jaw, then the tightness in your shoulders, then the constant vigilance that keeps your mind scanning for threats, for problems, for things to worry about. One by one, they release. One by one, they fade. You're not fighting anymore. You're not trying. You're just being carried, being rocked, being held by the rhythm of wheels on track, by the motion of the carriage, by the strange and wonderful fact that you don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to solve anything. You don't have to be anywhere or anyone. You're just a passenger, just a body in motion, just a mind finally quiet enough to rest. The train doesn't need you to stay awake. It doesn't need you to watch where it's going. It knows the way. It's been this way 1,000 times before, and it'll go this way 1,000 times again. Your attention isn't required. Your vigilance isn't needed. All that's asked of you is that you let yourself be carried. And so you do. You let go of the last thread of resistance. You stop holding yourself together. You stop trying to stay awake, trying to stay alert, trying to stay in control. You just drift. The rhythm carries you. The motion holds you. The darkness wraps around you like a blanket. And somewhere in that space between waking and sleeping, between here and there, between then and now, you find what those Victorian insomniacs found. Not just sleep, but rest. Not just unconsciousness, but peace. The train rolls on through the night, through fields and towns, through stations dark and silent, through a landscape that exists only in the space between departure and arrival, and you roll with it. Part of its motion, part of its rhythm, part of its endless journey toward nowhere in particular. This is what the doctors discovered all those years ago. This is what they tried to capture in their prescriptions and their journals and their endless theorizing. Not a cure, exactly. Not a treatment in the modern sense, but something older and simpler. Something that doesn't need to be understood to be effective. Something that works because it's worked for as long as humans have existed. The simple, profound gift of being carried. And now it's yours. This moment. This rest. This permission to let go. The train of this story has brought you to its final station. The rhythm of these words has done its work. All that's left is for you to stay here, in this space of surrender, as long as you need. So rest now. Let the story fade as dreams begin to take its place. Let the rhythm continue in whatever form it takes. The hum of a fan. The distant sound of traffic. The silence that's never quite silent. Let yourself be carried into whatever comes next. Knowing that you don't have to direct it, don't have to control it, don't have to do anything at all. The journey is over. The train has arrived. And you, finally, are home. End of script. Sweet dreams.